And I would like to introduce Professor Louise Archer from King's College London. And I'm very happy to have you here with us today on the conference because of the subject of your research and the result of the research and the possible impact of the research for our self-perception, communication and understanding of our role. And now I will switch to Polish. May I? Bardzo się cieszę z tego wykładu, ponieważ kapitał naukowy, który będzie przedmiotem tego wykładu, jest jednym z pojęć, które chyba w bardzo wartościowy i operacyjny sposób porządkuje nasze myślenie o tym, na czym może polegać rola instytucji edukacji nieformalnej w procesie uczenia się i budowania postaw uczniów i ich opiekunów. I dlatego bardzo cieszę się z ostatniego wykładu naszego dzisiejszego pierwszego dnia konferencji, który wygłosi profesor Louise Archer z King's College z Londynu. Zapraszam.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real honour to be invited here to talk with you, and it's particularly wonderful to be in the fantastic Copernicus Centre as well. I hope that the speed at which I talk is okay. Sometimes I get excited and I talk very fast, so if you want me to slow down, just wave at me or shout or nicely. Oh, thank you. So I'm going to talk today about our research on science capital. If my talk is rather long and boring, we have a 2-minute animation, a cartoon that you can see a still from there, which we have online, which the details are at the end. So if you want it very short, there's a 2-minute thing on Science Capital that you can find. So to start off, I wanted to start with a couple of stories from some children who've been taking part in our research. Oh, gone too far. So these are 4 young people, and all of them love science. We've been tracking them since they were 10, they're now 16. We're going to keep tracking them till they're 18. So these are 4 different, we've got lots and lots of children, these are just 4. And I chose them because they have similarities and differences. So Robert and Gus are both white, upper middle class, very affluent boys. They both like science. Vanessa and Danielle are both working class girls. Vanessa is from a black African background and Danielle is white working class. But all of them like science, but they have very different routes and outcomes. So, Robert and Vanessa both have parents who have what we call science capital. For instance, Robert's, his parents have degrees in science and engineering areas. Vanessa, her dad does not have much money or economic capital, but he did train as, he got an undergraduate degree in science from his home country and now works as a science technician. But Gus and Danielle have no science capital in their families. They have no family members with science qualifications or jobs. They're also very different in how much science they do outside of school, so informal science learning. Robert does loads. So he goes to STEM clubs, science clubs after school, engineering. He has his own workshop at home. He makes models and flies model aeroplanes. He reads lots and lots of science books at home. His family talk about science the whole time. At the dinner table, in the evening, it's what they watch on television. It's everywhere. It's throughout his whole life with his family. Vanessa's family also try and provide lots of opportunities. Her dad talks about science a lot. They watch science TV at home, but a bit less so than Robert. But Gus and Danielle don't do anything science related out of school. Now, Robert aspires to be an engineer, particularly an aeronautical engineer, and the strength of all this science that he gets at home, at school, out of school, all combines to this. Gus likes science, but he's going to be an author. It's okay, but it's not for him. Vanessa also loves science and she wants to be a scientist. And Danielle, even though she absolutely loves science and loves physics and would love to be a scientist, she decides very early on that science is not for her and she's not brainy enough to do science, and she gives it up and she's not going to continue with it. So we're interested in what makes these different patterns. How can we understand the ways that some children end up engaging with science and some don't? So the way we do that is the concept of science capital. So in Britain in particular, we're interested that over the decades, a lot of money, a lot of time and a lot of effort, millions of pounds, have been put into trying to increase young people's engagement with science. A lot of it has focused on how we make science more fun, so that young children enjoy it more. And there's also an idea that if we just introduce children to scientists or tell them about science or what scientists do, that maybe that will make a difference as well. But despite decades of these interventions, very little has changed in terms of who takes science at higher levels in the UK. And in particular, we're also interested that the profile of who engages with science museums and science centres also hasn't changed much. And particularly in the UK, it's predominantly white middle-class families who come to places like this. Zoos are a bit more diverse, but science centres and museums are very narrow in terms of who attends. So what makes one young person engage with science and one not? Well, our data suggests that lack of interest in science is not the main problem. So I'm going to show you some data from our 10-year Aspires study. So looking at young people's science and career aspirations from the age of 10, and we track the same cohort up to 18. So we use large-scale surveys. We've surveyed over 31,000 students to date. For example, last year when they were 16, there was 13,000 of them. And we also at the same time have interviews with 70 students and their parents over the same age period, so quite a big data set. And these are our findings so far, that basically it's not that they're not interested. So the different colour bars show the different ages of the students, so from blue as the youngest up to purple. And you can see, for example, the first set of bars, that most young people like science. They say, for instance, they learn interesting things in science lessons. And this carries on even though the purple bar at age 16, science gets quite hard and boring then because they're studying for our national exams. So schools are doing something right there to keep them interested. The second set of bars show that they also report that their parents actually think it's very important that they learn science. So it's not that they're completely lacking any parental interest or motivation. We also wondered, is it because they think they have terrible negative views of scientists? They think that they're all very geeky or antisocial. But again, the bars show that actually a lot of students, the majority, have positive views of scientists. For example, they think they do valuable work. But the last set of bars shows that none of these positive attitudes translate into the notion that science is for me. So, for example, very few students, and it's quite consistent as you can see over time, very few, for example, aspire to be a scientist or think that they could do a science job in the future. So we're interested in what causes this difference, what we call the being-doing divide. Most children like doing science, they just don't want to be it in the future. So I'm going to draw on one of our other projects, our Enterprising Science project, and this is an ongoing 5-year research and development project trying to understand young people's engagement with science. And it's a partnership between ourselves and the Science Museum in London and funded by BP. And we do, again, annual surveys and lots of interviews and observations and following students in schools and museums and in their families. And across the two projects, we've developed the idea of science capital as a way to try and help understand these patterns. So the concept draws on French sociologist Bourdieu's work on capital, the idea that you can have economic, social and cultural capital, and the idea the more you have of the right sort of capital, the better you are able to get on in society. So Bourdieu theorised capital predominantly in relation to the arts. So for him, it was about the sorts of paintings or art you appreciate if you go to the opera, the high arts. And we've extended it. He was writing in sort of 1960s France, and we've said, in the current, in contemporary society, we think science is actually a valuable commodity. It's a form of capital that can also help people get on. So we've come up with the idea of science capital, and we see it conceptually as a bit like a metaphorical bag or a hodl. I don't know if the word hodl always translates, but like a bag, which basically is a way of referring to all your science-related knowledge, attitudes, experiences, and so on that you acquire through life. Here's my bag. So roughly, the components of Science Capital fit roughly, you could say, into 4 pockets. So there's what science you know. This is like your scientific literacy, how confident you are in your scientific literacy. There's who you know. So does a young person have people they talk to in their everyday life? How often do they talk to them about science? Do they have parents in science-related careers? There's also how you think, which is about the attitudes and dispositions that you have towards science. Do you think science is useful in everyday life, for instance? Do you see it as related to your world? And what you do. So what sort of things do you do in your spare time? Do you watch TV, read books, magazines, come to science centres, and so on? So our research shows that basically the type of science capital you have isn't fixed. It's influenced by all the different areas of your life, home, school, out of school context, and you can keep acquiring it. It's not fixed at an early age. But drawing on Bourdieu, the value of your science capital is not fixed either. So it very much depends on the context, or what Bourdieu calls the field. So the value, how much your capital is worth, depends on the context that you're in, what it values, like a foreign currency. So our surveys show that the more science capital a young person has, those with high science capital, are significantly more likely to plan to continue with science after the age of 16, and they're significantly more likely to have what we call a science identity, so to see themselves and feel they're seen by other people as a science person. Levels of science capital vary dramatically between different social groups, and in England, those with high science capital are more likely to be boys, South Asian, and affluent, socially advantaged students. So I'm assuming there's a fair degree of museum educators in the room, and you're not adverse to a little bit of interactive sessions. So I thought if you just want to take 1 minute maximum to have a think about what science capital do you have, how does it fit or not in these pockets, and maybe discuss with the person next to you just for 30 seconds, just to get a sense of the... Oh, it'll be short. Okay, that's good. I can see there's lots of science capital being discussed, I hope. So if you now just hold your conversation for 1 second more. Now you've had a little think about what your science capital might be and how it might vary or differ from the person next to you. Now have a little think, and again, it's only 1 minute more. Which aspects do you think are the most important? And I'll show you the answers from our surveys in a minute. So just have 1 more minute just to discuss with your friend next to you, your colleague, which of these do you think are the most important, the most influential? Okay, so hopefully you've had a little think. So that's the end of our interactive bit. You can be quiet again. So, using statistical analysis of our surveys have lots and lots of different items, and when we analyse them to see which were most predictive of students having science identity and planning to continue with science, these were the top 8 in order. Maybe not what you said. So at the top is what you know, the confidence, how confident someone is in their scientific literacy. For example, whether they feel they agree with items like I know how to test a hypothesis, that kind of thing. Then we have quite a few of the who you know, the social capital, the social side of science capital. For example, particularly how often they talk with science with others, whether their parents have talked about it being important, about receiving encouragement for others, and who you know, your parents thinking science is important. The only one in the top 8 of what you do is reading science books and magazines out of school. So this is what's come out as most statistically significant. Our items had obviously things about science centres and museum visits and things like that. They weren't in the top 8, they were much, much lower down. And that's a point, it doesn't mean to say they're not important, which is depressing for those of us who work in this area, but it does mean that we need to think more carefully about it. On their own, they're not the answer. And then we have the dispositions, how you think. Particularly, it's this idea that this, which you see as a symbolic form of capital, the idea that, for example, understanding that science qualifications can help you get lots of different types of job, as a very powerful form of attitude. Thinking that science is everywhere in everyday life. Oop, lost one. That's it. So that's statistically what predicts. So we would suggest that existing efforts are not massively changing patterns of participation, and just wanting people to come and visit these fantastic places on its own may not solve the issue. We may need to think a little bit more broadly about what we do and what we offer. And we're interested in whether Science Capital can offer an additional lens for informal science education. And I'm going to outline 4 main challenges, and I'll talk through these in turn. So I won't read them now, but I'll just go through them. So the first, and this is based on the UK, so I don't know how far it will translate, but is reaching beyond the usual suspects. We tend to reach particular socially advantaged groups, and we're interested in how can we broaden that out. We think from our surveys in the UK, students in disadvantaged schools particularly aren't using out-of-school learning as much. So these are statistics from surveys of children in less privileged schools, so not representative in that sense. But so over half of them have never taken a science-related school trip. 42 have never gone to a museum on a school trip. You know, nearly 70% have never heard a visitor come and talk about science, and 74% have never been to an after-school science club. So these groups are not making best use of the opportunities that are out there at the moment. We also looked at the profile of who currently takes part in-school science enrichment, and these are predominantly the children in what we call the top set, so the highest attainers. So often museum visits are used in our schools as a reward for those who are already doing the best or attaining the highest. They have high science capital, and in our surveys of the disadvantaged students, it's predominantly our minority ethnic, our Black and Asian, and those students who tend to go on these trips more. But when we look at who takes part in out-of-school, non-school science learning activities, our Black students are much less likely to take part in these. So it's quite a stark difference between in-school and out-of-school. And it suggests across the board that we're not reaching these audiences enough. So we're worried that the students we're reaching currently in and out of school are already more privileged, and we need to broaden that more. So there are challenges in doing this. We use the bag metaphor of science capital, but we don't want to make out that students are coming with a so-called empty bag. That's okay. So it's important to understand that every student brings a bag of capital, of resources, of experiences, expertise with them. And our challenge is, how do we make use and connect with what's in people's bags, rather than just trying to fill a notion of an empty bag? So how do we respect and value difference? And how do we change our institutions to make an offer that fits for more people, rather than trying to change the people that come? So, in terms of how we can think about doing this, we think improving the equity offer of informal science learning institutions is important. So we followed lots of our students and their families on their first time visits to museums. We tracked them relentlessly through different museums that they visited, and most of them had never really been to them before. And we found that most of them feel very out of place. They don't know the rules of the game. For those of us who are familiar with it, there's an unspoken, taken for granted culture that we understand. For example, they don't know when you touch and when you don't touch something. So even on interactives, sometimes their families would say, don't touch it. And we say, no, it's okay, you can touch it. But they don't know. They don't know when you talk and when you don't talk and things like that. And lots of our students, when we interviewed them afterwards, would talk about feeling very different. So there's a quote there saying the museum they'd been to was lots of posh people, not many other races. And in particular, not many of them were able to translate what they brought with them into engagement with science within the museum. And this was partly because the dominant culture of science that they experienced on these visits was very white, male and middle class. And it really reinforced divisions rather than helped open them up. So we looked at how science was represented in the range of different museums that we went to. And across the board, it was very much aligned with masculinity. There were lots of what we've called big boys' toys, so lots of big machines, rockets, engines, things like that. And lots of privileging of white middle-class scientists as the people they saw as doing science within the museum, so the pictures and the representations. Femininity didn't feature very much in these places, and neither did other minority ethnic communities. Or where they were there, they're often very small, narrow representations. So for women, it was around childbirth. It was about the only form of femininity you ever saw. And for minority ethnic communities, it was more death and disease, which were not entirely positive. There weren't a whole range of different representations. On the plus side, the boys that we studied tended to feel quite at home and engaged enthusiastically. So there's a picture there of a boy with a stack of cards, and there's some field notes talking about how a group of boys were running excitedly round the gallery, and they were saying, these are my cars, they're mine. They try and touch them, and they call them, you know, it's my car. They sort of appropriate it, they have that sense of ownership. And in some ways, this was useful because these were boys from less privileged backgrounds who hadn't always been in museums. So in some sense, the idea of the masculinity connection helped them. And in particular, this notion of what we call laddishness in the UK, which is kind of macho type behaviour, that helped them engage at some exhibits. So, for example, there was an electric shock exhibit where you touch it and you get an electric shock. And this was fascinating for the boys because they were able to do masculinity, to be macho in this. So there's a quote from Jason who reached out and says, I'm going to be a man here, and touch it. And they often would compete with one another on the interactives. I'm sure you've seen this in practice. But one of the issues with this is it created a very male space. It represented science as masculine. And it could be very difficult for the girls to be authentic scientists in that space and to have a voice. So, for example, there's just a quote from Field Notes there. The students were doing little films they were making a trail for their families using video. And she asked if she could start her film about a plane. And a boy called Daniel, who'd previously been very, very quiet in the group, immediately stepped forward and took over, saying, because I'm the expert on planes. So it opened it up for him, but it closed it down for her. And the boys would often, particularly on competitive interactives, they would be in the zone. They would be very excited and competing with one another. So in some ways, it was good because we were engaging these disadvantaged young boys, but were they learning? So there's a worry that it was a bit hands-on, minds off, to coin the phrase. So there's just an extract from some field notes there. Jenny is a facilitator, an animator, and she's desperately trying to facilitate the boys at this electric shock exhibit to help them understand the link with the science. But they completely ignore her. They have no interest because they are just doing masculinity. We also asked them in discussion groups afterwards, thinking, well, maybe it seeped in afterwards. Maybe they understood the science connection afterwards. And they say, no, I'm still wondering what it had to do with science. They had no idea. They just thought, as the quote says, we got to mess around and play with things. Play is good, so we're not saying this is a bad thing at all, but we do feel that it is a challenge if the goal is around science learning and science identity, if students aren't getting a connection at all. And some families, when they came on their own visits, were worried about the interactives. They didn't feel that that was the science bit, so some parents tried to get their children away from the interactives and say, well, no, that's the play, let's go and find the science. So in some senses, it's fine, the boys are being engaged, but we did notice, particularly on the school trips, boys were rarely reprimanded for their loud, laddish behaviour, boyish behaviour, whereas the girls were very much excluded and sidelined. And some boys who were not what we call doing hegemonic masculinity, so they weren't dominant, they were doing other sorts of masculinity, they would be sidelined and ridiculed for not being strong enough or macho enough. And it affected their engagement with science. So I suppose the point we're making is that when masculinity is very strong in a science context, it can be problematic for girls and for other boys, for non-dominant boys. On the whole, the girls we followed didn't enjoy the museum visits as much. One girl called it as dry as toast. I don't know if that will translate. And they would very much resist doing any science on the visit. They were doing things like selfies. Again, I don't know if this is a comment, you know, when you take pictures of yourself. Well, I don't, but people do. The girls also, they wanted to perform femininity, and they couldn't do it with the science, so they did it against the science, and it meant they were often in competition, femininity and science. They were trying to stay feminine. So there's a quote there from a girl called Grace, who was worried, I'm talking a lot about the electric shock exhibit, there were more than that, but who was worried that this exhibit would make her hair go funny. Yeah. So she was constantly checking her hair in the screen and, you know, thinking it looked terrible and trying to redo it. There was also a girl, Hannah, who really liked computers, but when she was at an exhibit, she'd say to her friend, quick, drag me away before I get too excited. Now, we want her to be excited, but this idea that femininity is staying demure and not getting excited, it was problematic for the girls to do femininity and do science. And as Grace told her, try and stay dignified, which we all need to do. So we're wondering a more equitable approach. We're interested in how we can help students, whether it's in the classroom or in the science museum or the centre, connect their own diverse lives, knowledge and identities with ways of doing science and being in science. Some students did manage this quite well. Some of the students engaged really well with the task when they were able to draw on their own cultural resources. So some students made up raps about the science they were encountering, and were doing this for the other students. And families who came on visits would really engage with the exhibits when they could connect them to their own backgrounds. So there was an exhibit in one place called Foreign Ploughs, which to us was not the most exciting exhibit ever. It was some foreign ploughs from around the world. But the families loved this because it enabled them to talk about their cultural backgrounds, for the parents to share knowledge about farming or their lives back in Africa or Turkey or wherever it was with their families, and engage in that way, drawing on resources in their own science capital bags. So I think the way science is framed in museums can limit engagement for some, but particularly for students from non-dominant backgrounds. And we're interested in, well, how can we value and normalise multiple or hybrid intersectional ways of being to help open up science engagement for young people? And some of this will involve challenging some of the dominant stereotypes that we may take for granted in some of our institutions. We also want to emphasise that we don't expect any sector to be able to do this all on its own. It's a massive problem. It's very resistant to change. Statistically, when we did multi-level modelling, in school and out of school participation in informal science learning, there's lots of acronyms, I apologise for that, were very positively linked. And so we're interested in how across schools and science centres and clubs and the whole range of TV, media, the whole range of informal science learning, how can we make better pathways between these for young people? How can we connect up like the learning ecologies? And we also think that Science Capital can be useful as a tool to help us develop and evaluate our practice. So we're particularly suggesting it can be a reflection and development tool. So how does what we do address the different dimensions? How could we enhance our practice to address more? How do we reflect and value diverse backgrounds in that? And it can also be an evaluative tool. So we can use our questionnaires to measure, for instance, if students get more science capital as a result of what we're doing or not. And we can use it to reflect and evaluate. But I'll particularly just talk now at the end about reflection and development. So working with the Science Museum at the moment, we're looking at how we can reflect on practice to address the different pockets of the bag that we've got. So the idea of, you know, who you know, what you do, how you think, and what you know. And some of these will be more or less amenable to change than others. So it's very difficult to get more of our students, our young people's parents, to get a science degree. But it may be easier to work on their attitudes and their dispositions. So, for example, perceiving the relevance and the transferability of science, knowing that science can lead to lots of careers. You don't just do it if you want to be a scientist. We think this has a lot of scope. A lot of young children, the children in our study, aren't aware of this. And when we've tried to test out mini interventions before, it seems that when you shift this perception, it seems to last quite a long time afterwards. So it seems like a reasonable one to work with to develop this sort of symbolic form of knowledge, as we'd see it. And also how we work to leverage visitors' funds of knowledge. So how do we work with what people bring with them? How do we connect that with science? So there's just a quote there from the Science Museum. They say, building our audience's science capital is not about filling an empty hodl. We must find ways to make the most of the knowledge and experiences they have and help them recognise, value and apply the science in those, which we think is a useful way forward. So this is work in progress at the moment that we're undertaking. And so the Science Museum particularly leading on how we create a reflective framework, a tool that museum practitioners can actually use. And we're looking at this in terms of the science capital dimensions. So, for instance, how does a particular exhibit develop visitors' confidence in their scientific literacy? How can it convey the transferability and relevance of science? So we're not expecting every single interactive or exhibit, or even we're doing this in the classroom as well. Every lesson will address every single aspect of science capital. But we have noticed that a lot of teachers and some educators often get focused on the scientific literacy pocket and neglect the other three. So we're trying to get people to think more broadly. How science is represented in our museums is still a challenge, I think, could be broadened more. How does it promote discussion both in the moment? We obviously know that talking about science is a good way to promote engagement and learning and interaction with it, but also beyond the visit. So how do we link up in the learning ecologies outside? How does what you see here link to what you might then talk about or do at home? How does it make people link to the people they know, link science to the people they know in their everyday lives? And how can it encourage broader engagement? And just to finish with, here are some pictures. We tried out the recent seminar at the Science Museum in London with museum educators from across the country, and we took it into the galleries and did a workshop activity where people would find exhibits and test out with the hodl how it addressed and how it could be improved. So looking forward to taking that forward. And if you're interested in our project, we have lots of information on our website and our 2-minute animation if you want to know more about Science Capital. But I'll leave some time for questions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And now there's time for questions. Czyli czy mają Państwo pytania, uwagi dotyczące właśnie kapitału naukowego? Widzę 2, 3, tak szacuję. Dobrze, to poproszę może Dan, please ask the question.
Thank you. Hello, Louise. Thank you for the presentation. I've watched your animation. It's excellent.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed it. The question I'd like to ask is about those young people's conception of science and scientists. My experience at the Natural History Museum is that children and adults' conception of who is a scientist varies enormously. So if you go into, we tried it at our Science Uncovered event and asked people, do you want to be a scientist? A frequent answer was, no, I don't want to be a scientist, I want to be a doctor. Or I want to work in conservation. Those are conceivably both scientific fields, and your first graph, terrifying though it is, could hide a lot of different conceptions of who scientists are and what science is. Yeah. So I don't know if you did any investigation of what people meant by those terms, but I'd be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. So I'd say on the whole, their notion, I mean, obviously, and over time, when particularly in the Aspire study, tracking from 10 to 16 so far, they do develop over time. But generally, I agree, they're very narrow. The more science capital a child has, the more differentiated their notion of a scientist may be, and the more different types of scientists they might name, and the more likely they are to say, well, most people use some science in their jobs. But they're more of the minority, I'd say. So we had children who'd say, I want to be a vet, but don't see any, or a dentist, there's no science in that. And I think we're interested in really broadening that out, but also getting away from the notion that science just leads to being a scientist, and flagging that science is very transferable for any job. So we're trying to get kids to understand that, yes, I mean, that scientist is broader than they think, but actually that's not the end point. The goal is to understand that science leads to, science skills are useful for anything. So we have an activity where they list careers that they like and then apply science skills to that, and basically they end up with the outcome that even if you want to be a celebrity, which a depressing number of our children do want to be, that actually science skills are still useful for that, because they still need to problem solve when their agent runs off with money, or however they frame it. But yeah, thank you.
Widziałam pytanie jeszcze z tamtej. Proszę bardzo.
Thank you for the talk. My question will be in the same, actually the same field as the previous one, but actually I wanted to ask you what kind of social change you're aiming at with your research, whether your objective is rather to develop scientific literacy or making more people scientists. So it's very much similar question, but I'm asking about your objective as a research group.
Thank you. So our primary motivation or concern is with improving public scientific literacy. Obviously, when you apply for funding, you also talk about the pipeline, but we're less concerned personally as a research group about, the King's research group about the pipeline. We see it as a social justice issue, and that actually science skills and engagement with science can help improve the life chances of all the students. By doing that, I think it would also benefit the pipeline. But.
Dobrze, czy z tej strony jeszcze jakieś pytanie? Nie? Państwo? Nie. Tu. Diana.
Yes. Wonderful talk, very inspiring, but it depresses me as well, because I have a hunch that we're much too late, that we should be, we should be starting embedding all these values, children when they're 2, 3, 4. So in that sense, I'm very curious about how our community can help towards really, because I think that, if we start at 7, 8, we're much too late. So how do we tackle that problem that's something that really, really is on my mind.
Yeah, I agree. I think particularly our data from the children aged 10 shows that these are already ingrained by then, which is depressing. So yeah, we very much support efforts to go younger, but I think also to thread it all the way through. We're in, and I suppose across formal and informal as well. I think that notion of linking up more. We often tend to work in silos, I think.
The formal is a big problem, to be honest.
Yes. So we're piloting at the moment in the Enterprising Science Project an approach with science teachers where they science capitalise they enhance their teaching using the lens, which is basically teaching what you're going to teach, but then informally we call it pimp my curriculum, which may not translate as well, but yeah, they basically tweak it in that way to try and address a broader range of things.
Dobrze. Panie profesorze, oczywiście.
I have just two examples from our recent political history in Poland, which show how what is the result of the lack of what you call a scientific capital. The one is the amber gold business. You might not know it. It was a Ponzi scheme which operated in town of Gdańsk, where thousands of people lost the money, for they were offered idiotically something even on the boards. I mean, if you read it, offers to increase the income by a miracle of whatever. That's one example. The other, which is much more serious, is what is in this country called the Swiss franc loans business. People have been borrowing money to pay for the houses, but they were borrowing money, quotation mark, in Swiss francs, when the official exchange rate was extremely low. Now it's twice as high, so people are essentially bankrupt. If they had, that doesn't need to be a scientist to know that it requires elementary knowledge of mathematics, how to calculate a percentage and something like this. So that these are two examples. And if I am permitted, there's a comment to your question. Yes, we should start with the children at the age 2 or even earlier. But this is not going to happen rapidly. We are not going to change. And when we start now, the way we know it, how to do it with the children at the age 7, 9 or something, they eventually will grow up and they will, the new generation, and they will take care by themselves for their children, hopefully. So all those changes we are talking about have to be seen in the long time perspective. There is no short-time solution to any problem in education. That is why this recent debate in Poland that they're repainting the labels on the doors of the schools will solve all the problems. That we will change the name of the schools and that everything will be fine, is completely missing any sense. The education changes are like the oil tanker on the ocean. It takes enormously long time to turn it, right? And trying to operate the rudder back and forth doesn't help. So that was my comment. I mean, we have to start right now with the way we know it. And eventually it will perpetuate itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I attended a talk in Parliament in England last week, and they're talking about the future skills issue around lack of science, technology, engineering and math skills. And the point was made that the crisis that is predicted now, it's too late to plan for that now. We've missed the chance because of the long education lag that takes. So it's, yeah, sobering thought.
Okay, dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much for the lecture.